200 дней мы воевали с русскими войсками. 200 дней мы не спали и не дыхали. Но так же, как наше восстание началось, она еще и развилась.
This is what remains of Grozny, a once prosperous city destroyed by the Second Chechen War. For most, the Russian invasion meant misery and death. But to one man, it was his greatest moment of opportunity. This is the story of how Vladimir Putin rose to power through the ashes and fire of the Chechen Wars.
Nestled between the snow-capped mountains of the North Caucasus, the Chechens inhabited the mountainous peaks at the crossroads between Asia and Eastern Europe, adamantly independent in protecting their lands. However, starting in the 17th century, a new northern neighbor had been growing in influence, the Russian Empire. Eager to expand its borders southward to the lucrative trade routes of the Caucasus, Russia started a campaign of conquest against the various mountainous tribes, with the Chechens eventually falling to Russia in 1859. Their resentment towards the Russian occupiers never ceased, and the Chechen people undertook numerous doomed attempted uprisings. This hatred was fueled even more in the 1860s, when Tsar Alexander II enacted the forced migration of Chechens and various other ethnic groups in the region. Unfortunately, this would not be the last time the Chechens were subjugated to deportation. In 1917, the Russian Empire collapsed into a civil war that resulted in the creation of Soviet Russia. During this time, an angry Chechnya remained in Russian hands. This anger was feared by the Soviet leadership during World War II, as an alliance between the resentful Chechens and the invading German army could prove to be devastating to the Soviet war effort. As a result, the Soviet leadership began the systematic deportation of more than 500,000 Chechens eastward towards Siberia. This mass deportation only added fuel to the fire for Chechen resentment, turning into a yearning for independence as the USSR began to decline.
In the 1980s, the misallocation of resources paired with a declining oil industry caused economic stagnation. Additionally, the loss faced by the Soviets during the Soviet-Afghan War added more pressure. Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev initiated a wave of reforms. However, this wasn't enough to save the USSR. After a failed coup attempt, Gorbachev resigned on December 25, 1991, leaving Boris Yeltsin as the new president. This was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. These were the words that future Russian President Putin used to describe this turbulent time. However, Putin had little power to stop the Soviet Union's fall. Only being a small figure within the KGB, he had limited political influence. According to him, the situation demanded immediate action, stating that the epidemic of collapse has spilled over to Russia itself, referring to smaller territories around the border demanding independence. As inflation and unemployment rates soared from economic instability, affording ordinary goods and services became extremely difficult. Economic grievances fueled political discontent. This political discontent would fuel nationalistic sentiments across Russia. For the Russian majority, nostalgia for the Soviet era lingered and imperialistic desires remained in hopes to rebuild its old glory. For ethnic minorities, though, nationalistic sentiments led to calls for a complete break from Russian rule.
A nationalist sentiment was brewing in Chechnya as the people had remembered the bloody legacy of Russian rule, and they saw an opportunity to secure their freedom and make sure no such crime would be committed against their people again. In 1991, Zhokhar Dudayev was elected president of Chechnya, and he declared Chechnya an independent nation. What followed was 3 years of failed negotiations and diplomatic failures between Dudayev and Yeltsin, culminating in an assault on the Chechen capital, Grozny. After bloody and ruthless fighting, much of Grozny was left in ruins by Russian bombardment. Families were torn, thousands upon thousands had died, and many more had been made refugees. The Russian forces, after many casualties, took the city in 1999, but the Chechens continued to fight. As the leader of the outmatched separatists, Dudayev organized fierce guerrilla resistance based on the Mujahideen. Small groups of fighters rapidly used guerrilla-style tactics to ambush and harass Russian forces. The mountainous terrains of Chechnya gave the separatists an advantage for using concealment as a key method for surprise raids. In March of 1996, a group of Chechen guerrillas used these tactics to mastery. The Chechen forces fully recaptured Grozny and embarrassed Russia and Yeltsin. Political support waned for the war, and Yeltsin and his generals were forced to end the war in their attempts of taking back Chechnya. Russia had lost.
With the beginning of Yeltsin's fall, a new figure would rise: Vladimir Putin. In 1991, Putin took his first step into holding public office by moving to St. Petersburg to work under the mayor. Starting there, Putin began to rise with ranks of political office, until
In 1991, he took his largest step yet when he was appointed prime minister. Now, he held the second highest office in Russia and waited for an opportunity to take the final step. That opportunity would come in the form of a radical Islamist faction within Chechnya on August 7, 1999. The leader of this group, Shamil Basayev, alongside his soldiers, crossed the Russian border. They entered the Russian Republic of Dagestan, a Muslim-majority region of Russia, in hopes of creating a pan-Islamic caliphate. Fighting broke out, and their actions were seen as an act of war by Putin. But this was only the beginning. In September 1999, a series of bombings hit Russia. On the 4th, in Buynaksk, on the 9th and 14th, in Moscow, and on the 16th, in Volgodonsk. These bombings led to the deaths of hundreds of innocent civilians. It was, and continues to be, inconclusive on who committed these crimes. But to one man, it was clear who was responsible. Prime Minister Vladimir Putin blamed the Chechen leaders. Chechen militants denied involvement in the bombings, but it was too late. Putin was able to tap into the fears of the Russian people. He presented himself as someone who would bring justice, someone who would end the political instability that started with Gorbachev, and someone who could make Russia great again. The Second Chechen War had begun.
Putin would call for massive airstrikes to be conducted over Chechnya to root out militants and to destroy the morale of the Chechen military and people. The bombings continued throughout September. Those who could leave the city became refugees. But those who could not leave, most of whom were elderly, poor, or disabled, had to witness and suffer the ceaseless bombings. But the bombings were only the beginning. On September 28th, Putin announced an invasion into Grozny, tapping into those national fears which had brewed since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Through a direct and absolute speech, corner the bandits in the shithouse and wipe them out. There's nothing left to discuss. In December, Russian troops began their ground assault on Grozny. Brutal urban fighting would ensue, with civilians still stuck in the city. During this fighting, due to both health issues and political pressure for his internal policies, Yeltsin would resign and appoint Putin as acting president. Now, all Putin had to do was secure victory, and he would have the ability to secure a full presidency. February came and Putin would have his victory. The Russian forces would, through brute force, capture the city permanently. The course of the fighting had left Grozny a rotten carcass of a city, vacant of life. Cluster munitions left empty derelicts in what were once homes for families. Because of the mass destruction, Grozny was awarded the tragic title of the most bombed city since World War II. Over 300,000 civilians fled the violence, leaving behind their homes, and to this day, many have yet to be able to return.
Despite the humanitarian catastrophe of the war, Putin was able to escape any real consequences. He enjoyed strong domestic support for the war because of the nationalist sentiment he stirred and as a result of the swift end of the war. Putin's rise would become a turning point in Russian history. He would solidify his unilateral rule by forcing his influential oligarchy into a deal where they would support him in exchange for financial independence. With all Russia now bowing down to him, Putin commenced his ultimate goal, reversing the greatest geopolitical disaster and reconquering the territory lost in the 90s. This prompted a dramatic change in Russia's foreign policy. In 2008, pro-Western Mikhail Saakashvili came to power in Georgia. His goal was to bring Georgia into NATO. Fearing a loss of influence over the nation, Russia launched an invasion into the north of Georgia. In just 5 days, 412 people would perish. After the war in Georgia, Russia looked westward. In 2014, the people in Ukraine demanded the removal of the pro-Russian puppet in power, Viktor Yanukovych. This led to the Euromaidan revolution in Kyiv, prompting Yanukovych to flee the country. Out of anger, Putin deployed troops to take over Crimea. In 2022, Putin started a total war, attacking Ukraine from almost every direction. Despite this, the Ukrainian army fought back resiliently, managing to push back multiple offensives. But that didn't mean that the Ukrainian armed forces were able to prevent Russian atrocities. In Bucha, women were raped, men were shot, and countless civilians were murdered. Mariupol and Bakhmut are no longer livable because the Russian army reduced them to rubble. Today, the world still lives in the shockwaves of the Second Chechen War. Putin's power grab during the instability of the Second Chechen War allows him to do as he pleases around the world. And as Putin gets older, his decisions become increasingly dangerous. This begs the question, although it is the Ukrainians that fight alone against the Russians today, who knows who may be fighting the Russians tomorrow?